we have different mechanisms in our brain where we drift into our feelings, and then we drift into our thinking, but they're not always engaged in the moment. And when we are engaged in the moment, which will be a segue to our mental mindfulness, I think, then our brains function in a way that is much more productive. And I think this is related to that. I think that's when we really...
Exactly. Yes. And when we're just sort of lost in our feelings, it's a different part of the brain. It's the amygdala. It's the emotional brain. And when we start to think and search, and the second, this is a good segue into the second thing, which is labeling negative feelings. So that's more of an executive function, a prefrontal. The parts of the brain, I mean, for the purpose of this discussion, anyone listening, it doesn't matter. Like, but the shift, knowing that when we start to label negative feelings, for example, you're feeling really bad, and we start to feel helpless, we start to feel anxious, we start to all these things like I want to get rid of. It's so normal to just, when you start to feel bad, to say, I want to get rid of this. I want to feel better. But if you can just sort of pause, and when you're feeling bad, not try to get rid of it, but just label it, just say worrying. It is so simple, but putting feelings into words really does, and this is the shift from the amygdala focus, the emotional brain, into the prefrontal cortex, which makes us feel more empowered.
And that's the essence of mindfulness, isn't it?
It is, exactly. It's one of the core principles of mindfulness. Yeah.
That's why people feel so amazing after that, when they do their exercises, because there's something that shifts in ourselves that goes from anxiety, panic, to being in a calm space, knowing what we're doing. That's what the feeling is all about. And sometimes I compare it to having a room full of stuff and not having any shelves and places to put them in. So once we start labeling them, our stuff, it feels like we're kind of putting the room in an order, and then it feels so much more serene, and I can do it, that feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about labeling, and not in a pejorative or in a punitive way, because that when we start to do that, when we get really critical, or when we attach to something, it's not just, it's feeding an attachment to whatever it is that we're experiencing, a repulsion or wanting to hold on to it, versus how it's just natural to have millions of different thoughts and feelings throughout the day. And so when something comes up that is making us feel really worried, it's automatic that we just start to worry about what's going to happen as a result. And so this facilitates the role of the observer.
Yes. And that observing place in us is the seat of what we call the self, right? So that once our self is activated, we feel much more empowered, we feel much more in action, and so capable of dealing with what we're having at hand, rather than just having this anxiety, this feeling of something really bad is going to happen, and without naming it, we kind of avoid it without even being aware of what we're avoiding, actually. I will never forget, I was pregnant with my first child, and I was feeling this dread, and I couldn't explain what that was. And of course, being very heavily pregnant, I felt very confined at home. I felt very lonely, not knowing. So I called my friend, who luckily was also a therapist, and then I told her how I feel, and I was feeling depressed and this, and then she told me, yeah, you think that if you're depressed, what you're describing it feels like you think you're going to die. Just watch it, just like you said, just watch yourself sitting there feeling dreadful, and actually realize we're not dying. And that was like the biggest enlightenment of my life. I realized, yes, and this too will pass.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's so funny that you're saying that. I just spoke to some, I don't want to jump right into
no, I was
that,
done
because
anyway.
I love that you shared that story. Um, and yeah, there's something about not even just watching it, but moving towards it, and welcoming it, and doing the opposite of what our impulse is, which is to, to run away from it. And I just said, I mean, it's so funny because I was just speaking to someone, a patient this morning, who's feeling overwhelmed because his car broke down, and the circuits in his apartment went off, and he was just like going into this total victim, place of why me, and feeling overwhelmed, and just helping him to sort of see and say, this too shall pass. And it's something now I think that will forever be sort of associated in my mind, is that sitting after my mother died, and sitting in the funeral, and I was about to talk at her funeral, and just being so aware of all the different feelings that I was feeling, and telling myself to really making an effort to stay present, and telling myself, comforting myself by saying, this too shall pass.
Yeah.
I'm
Sorry to interrupt, but having that almost like dual awareness of, yes, I am here and hurting so much, and I feel so lost and anxious, and all the other feelings that come with the loss of a parent. And yet, knowing that today in 2018, as an adult, you are perfectly capable of dealing with whatever comes and making a decision there and then that you will be present, is amazing.
Yeah,
It's so powerful.